Nice to have you back after lunch, and certainly look forward to a very interesting and rewarding time together this afternoon. A word from our sponsors. This conference is, as we mentioned earlier this morning, sponsored by BYU Studies, which publishes lots of materials in journals and books and on the web here at BYU. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list or get a subscription, you can get a little blue form that you can fill in out at the table. We also are co-sponsoring this conference with the Temple Studies group here in Utah, and the website for that is templestudies.org. This afternoon, we're going to begin with Gary Rendsburg, and he serves as the Blanche and Irvine Laurie Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University and holds positions in the Department of Jewish Studies and the Department of History there. His teaching focuses, as he says, on all things ancient Israel, but particularly language and literature. He's written books on various subjects, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, and focuses on the Cairo Geniza. Titles of his books include The Bible and the Ancient Near East, another one on the Song of Songs, and he takes particular pride in his work with graduate students. He earned his BA degree in English from the University of North Carolina and an MA degree and PhD also from the Hebrew Studies from the New York University. One of his previous books has recently come out in a new 2014 edition on the chiastic structures of Genesis. So he and I have many reasons to be good friends. His topic today, the Psalms, as hymns in the Jerusalem temple at Passover and throughout the year. Gary?
Thank you very much, Jack, for that very gracious introduction. Up until this morning, Jack and I had never met except in various bibliographies, one published by the other. So it was nice finally to meet this very warm, friendly, lovely human being whose material I've read for decades. And just want to thank Jack and the staff here involved with the organizing of this one-day seminar and tomorrow in Logan. This is my second time at BYU. My third time coming through the area. My wife and I did a cross-country trip a couple of years ago and came through as well. And I just want to tell you, as somebody who lives, Jim Charlesworth and I both live in New Jersey, relatively flat except for one corner of the state. Don't take it for granted that you've got 7,000-foot snow-capped mountains outside, okay? It's something really to... And George lives on the Atlantic, so it's really such a great part of the country, and Utah is just stunningly beautiful. The landscape, and as we've learned on our visits to BYU, the community as well. Dan this morning showed various artist rendering of the first temple built by Solomon. Here's yet another one. And of course, this is all based, all of these reconstructions are based on the information provided in the Bible in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 6. This is a floor plan and an elevation plan, again, very similar to what Dan showed this morning. Can we envision, there are no remains of this first temple of Solomon, can we envision what it looked like and what happened in it? I'll be moving from this to the second temple in a few minutes. Well, we obviously, without any archaeological remains of the first temple, which are buried beneath the remains of the second temple, which are buried beneath the remains of a Roman temple and a Christian church and the Dome of the Rock and so on, we can only use our imaginations and use comparative evidence. Now, the best preserved temple in the ancient world is from Edfu in southern Egypt, temple to Horus. Look at the size. Now, Solomon's temple, of course, paled in comparison to this. Edfu was a late temple. It was built during Ptolemaic times, the Greco-Roman period in Egypt over the course of a few centuries, 3rd, 2nd centuries BCE. You can see the people down here. at the very bottom at the entrance to give you a sense of the enormity of these, the exterior walls of the pylons of this temple and the statues of Horus at its entranceway. It has a rectangular shape, just like the Temple of Solomon does. This is a long-standing Near Eastern temple building tradition, which we see everywhere from Egypt through Israel into North Syria. This is the exterior wall of that very long wall that you saw. For those of you who've been to Egypt, these are called puddles. It almost never rains in Egypt, but of course it rained the day before when I was there, and there they are. Inside the temple, into the outer courtyard, as I mentioned, more statues of Horus, the falcon-headed god who represents kingship. You see the crown on top of his head, and the pharaoh himself represented Horus incarnate as the king of Egypt. And then we proceed into the inner sanctums of the temple, looking down that long axis, and we come to the Holy of Holies, where you see what we'll call the Ark. Now, the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle and then in Solomon's temple was horizontal, and this one is vertical. But you get a sense of the continuity of temple building, and you could use all sorts of examples from the ancient world. And this is where the actual idol of Horus that would have been treated by the gods, dressed by the gods, by the priests, washed by the priests, and so on a daily basis. May I point out to you that as a tourist in Egypt today, you go here, you go to Karnak, any of these temples, you will see more than an average ancient Egyptian ever would have seen, who would not have been permitted to enter the Holy of Holies of these sanctuaries. So this is quite remarkable that we as modern tourists can go into these places. Now, what went on in these temples, right? Because we don't have any of this portrayed in pictures from Solomon's temple, nor for the second temple in Jerusalem for that matter. Again, we rely on these kinds of images from Egyptian temple walls, processions, offerings, more offerings, and to segue into the topic of my talk, musical accompaniment to the rituals that were happening in these temples, both instrumental music and vocal music. This is from a temple in the far south of Egypt, south of Aswan in Nubia, built by Ramses II. Egyptian texts provide for us a good number of hymns. This is an example. This is actually in the National Archaeological Museum in Greece, in Athens. And we have all sorts of hymns. This one to the god Ra. This is just one sample of dozens which I could show to you. And these would have been hymns that were sung to the gods in the temples. A little bit closer to Israel, both geographically and culturally, Ugarit in far northern Syria, great site of the late Bronze Age, well excavated by the French over the course of decades in the 20th century, and several thousand clay tablets in a whole series of languages, the local Ugaritic language, Akkadian, Hurrian, etc., were found there. And the most striking of them is this, a Hurrian text, which is a hymn to Nikal. There's a photo of it and a transcription of it for those of you who want to get started on the cuneiform. This turns out to be the oldest text in the world in which we have not only the libretto, the words, but also the musical notations. And the musical notations were deciphered by Ann Kilmer of University of California at Berkeley, who then published the CD of it, recorded it with the very felicitous title, Sounds from Silence, along with two colleagues, and there's a picture of Anne stringing up her ancient lyre. She's an expert on ancient musical traditions. If we move to Mesopotamia, I don't have things to show you, but we also find there all sorts of material in the Babylonian tradition and in other cuneiform literatures of temple rituals accompanied by song and instrumentation. And much of this has been put together in a book by Richard Henshaw called Female and Male. And chapter 2, which you can see comprises 50 pages, is devoted to singers and musicians and dancers. Now, all of this is my historical background, is historical context for you as we segue back to the world of Israel, which is my main topic today, and to the first temple of Solomon. Something just happened. Here we go. Went far ahead there for some reason. The most striking thing as you read through the texts of the Torah, which deal with the rituals in the tabernacle, which were all then later transferred to the temple in Jerusalem once it was built by Solomon, is that you have all of these ritual texts, especially in the book of Leviticus, but in other texts as well in the Torah, and never a word is spoken, never a word is sung, and no instruments are played. You have mention of the silver trumpets, but that's an exception. You have perhaps one or two passages spoken by somebody, but those are also exceptional. There simply is no material in the Torah about any words being spoken or sung or music being played while the temple rituals were happening, while the sacrifices were going on. In stark contrast to what I've just shown you from the worlds of Egypt, Canaan, Mesopotamia, etc. And this led the great synthesizer of ancient Israelite religion, Yechezkel Kaufman of the Hebrew University, who in his magnum opus, 5 volumes in Hebrew condensed into a single volume in English translation called The Religion of Israel, pointed out that the temple in Jerusalem was a sanctuary of silence, that the priests went about their work according to the priestly texts of the Torah without a word being uttered, without a sound being heard. His disciple, not that he was a direct teacher of him, but Yisrael Knoll of the Hebrew University has in fact used that phrase, the sanctuary of silence, for his book on the subject, which continues the idea that unlike all the other peoples of the ancient Near East and further afield as well, the priests in Jerusalem went about the rituals in the temple without any song or words. So you have these very long texts in the book of Leviticus. I don't expect you to be reading these as I go through them in chapter 4. And all of this detailed description about how to sacrifice a bull and for what purpose and so on, and what to do with the appendage on the liver and the kidneys and so on and so forth. And this goes on for chapters, thousands of words, but never do you have mention of music. Similarly, another ritual, Leviticus 16, which deals with the ritual concerning the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, it goes on for verse after verse, very long chapter, no mention of anything that we know from elsewhere in the ancient world. The Temple of Solomon, as conceived by the priests of ancient Israel, was truly a sanctuary of silence. Now, in 1 Kings 8, when the temple is built, you have Solomon's speech. This, I would say, is the non-priestly view, what some scholars would call the Deuteronomistic view, which provides for something else in Solomon's temple than you would gain if you were to read through those texts in Leviticus, which I've just shown you a few samples of. Because here in 1 Kings chapter 8, Solomon addresses God, and I've highlighted the words for you such as prayer and supplication and the verb to pray, that this temple, according to Solomon's dedication, is in fact not a temple in which sacrifice will be the main function. That's why I'm calling it the non-priestly view. But rather it is a place where prayer will occur. Now, there's a difference between prayer and hymn, I understand. But nevertheless, we're now talking about people coming to the temple in Jerusalem to actually issue forth prayers to God. Now, I don't want you to think for a moment that there was any such thing as congregational prayer. There wasn't yet, and there wouldn't be ever necessarily in this system. The temple, of course, always was first and foremost a place of sacrifice. On the altar by the priest to the one God of Israel. But at least you have here another voice, no pun intended, being heard, where you do get the notion of prayer and supplication in the sacred space. And here's some of that in Hebrew for those of you who can read the Hebrew. And it's always good to have a little Hebrew spoken on any day of the week. Ufanita el tfilat avdacha ve'el tachinato Adonai Elohai lishmoa el harina ve'el hatefillah asher avdacha mitpalel lefanecha hayom. That was just the Hebrew of one of the verses I showed on the previous image. And at the conclusion of Solomon's long prayer of dedication, long words of dedication, you have more of the same And verse 45, and you shall hear in the heavens their prayer and their supplication, meaning the prayers and supplications of others. And you shall hear in the heavens the habitation of your abode, their prayer and their supplication. So that not only the sacrifices occur, but Solomon's speech envisions words being spoken in the temple. Now, it's true that he sacrifices on that day, according to the text at the end of chapter 8, an enormous number of animals. But in his speech, sacrifice is not mentioned. Now, Solomon's death brought about the division of the kingdom into the two kingdoms of Israel, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The Jerusalem temple would continue to function as the temple for the kingdom of Judah in Jerusalem, its capital city, down to its destruction in 586 BCE. In the northern kingdom of Israel, two temple cities were set up at the geographical extremes of the kingdom, Dan in the far north and Bethel in the far south, both of which you can see here on the map. Now, both of these sites have been excavated, and in fact, at Dan, we have found the altar site, not the original one set up in the 10th century when the split in the kingdom occurred, but dated to about a century later in the 9th century. And the metal frame that you see there has been put up by the archaeologists and the Antiquities Authority and the National Parks of Israel to envision what the altar would have looked like with the horns of the altar indicated there, those protrusions on the four corners, which are described on altars or mentioned in the book, in the various books of the Bible. Bethel has also been excavated, in fact, by W.F. Albright, but we, as far as I know, have not found the sacrificial site at Bethel. But there are the two sites, Dan and Bethel. Now, this becomes relevant because of a passage in Amos chapter 5. So Amos 5, the last verse of which here, verse 24, is quite famous, is preceded by the prophet Amos speaking in the first-person voice of God, saying, I loathe, I spurn your festivals, I do not delight in the smell of your solemn assemblies. And then he goes on in verse 22, as you can see, and then in verse 23 says, Haser me'alai hamon shirecha, v'zimrat nivalecha lo eshma. Remove from me the loud sound of your hymns, and the music of your lyres let me not hear. So you notice that in verse 22, you have the reference to the burnt offerings and the meal offerings and the fatlings, which are being offered by the priests. Amos is active in Bethel. So this is situated in Bethel, even though we haven't found the altar site there. I showed you at least one image of the excavations. And right after that, in conjunction with that, is the reference to the fact that you have music, both hymnal music, right, choral music of some sort, and instrumental music represented here by the lyres. So even though the Torah understands a system of a sanctuary of silence, in the temple at Bethel at least, hymnic and instrumental music had already begun by the 8th century when Amos was alive to accompany the temple sacrificial rituals. I would argue that the priests may have their ideal in which they react to the ancient Near Eastern polytheistic world with its hymns and music and so on, as I illustrated at the beginning. But that the people at large who visit these temples, their voices could not be silenced. That on a popular level, which is to say, opposed to the priestly perfection, if I can use that expression, or the priestly paradigm which they set up, that the people at large, there seems to have been, if I can reconstruct part of this, a democratic movement almost, to introduce song, hymns, music, instruments, and so on into temple rituals. Now, in Judah, back to Jerusalem, and we can extrapolate from the Amos passage set in Bethel that most likely this was happening in Dan as well. Now, okay, I seem to have skipped a passage here. There's also one text in the book of Isaiah which suggests that this was also happening at the time in Jerusalem in the 8th century as well. But I don't have that image. Later on, towards the end of the first temple's existence in Jeremiah 33, as the temple's being destroyed, Jeremiah anticipates a time when the temple would be actually rebuilt, and he refers to the voice of joy and the voice of gladness and the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. And these are not just the explicit voices of brides and bridegrooms, but the voice of ultimate joy on marriage day and so on. And then he actually quotes at one point the voice of those who say, "Give thanks to the Lord of hosts, for the Lord is good, for his kindness is everlasting," as they bring the thanksgiving offering to the house of the Lord. Which is to say, from Jeremiah, we understand that circa 600 BCE, you have people in Jerusalem bringing their Todah sacrifice, right? That's the thanksgiving offering. And in fact, Todah remains the modern Hebrew word for thank you. They brought their Todah sacrifice, which is described in Leviticus, except when it's described there, needless to say, there's no mention of any speech happening. But here they bring it, and they bring it with this expression of thanks to God, verbal expression. Strikingly, that same phrase appears in Psalm 100, whose superscription says Mizmor LeTodah, a psalm of thanksgiving. And the very expression that we just saw in Jeremiah occurs here as well. Now, this can't be a setup because the editorial history of the book of Jeremiah is very different from and independent from the editorial history of the book of Psalms. So it can't be that somehow some biblical overarching editor did all this. No, quite contrary. Quite to the contrary. This psalm, the only one which is called a psalm of thanksgiving in the 150 psalms of the Psalter, is the very one that is actually quoted in the book of Jeremiah, because this is actually happening, and this was happening at the time of the first temple, or at least towards the end of the first temple's existence in Jerusalem. Now, a whole series of psalms bear the superscription that they are in some way related to the sons of Korah. Now, the sons of Korah are referred to later on in the book of Chronicles, and I'm going to come back and talk about Chronicles in a bit, as amongst the temple singers. Now, we have no evidence for them really in the first temple period, because even though Chronicles is talking about the reign of Jehoshaphat during the first temple, since it was authored in the second temple period, it is most likely a retrojection of what was happening in the second temple. We'll segue there in just a moment, back into first temple times. But what's interesting is that we now move to another archaeological site, Arad, in the southern part of the kingdom of Judah, where a small temple was found. This is the Holy of Holies of that temple. It was destroyed around 700 BCE, either by the Assyrian advance into Judah or perhaps by King Hezekiah, pushing the centralization of worship in Jerusalem. But in an adjacent room to this temple, this ostrakon was found, inscribed piece of pottery, and there is a list of individuals and groups of individuals, and on this list is in fact the term B'nai Korach, the sons of Korach. So this is not a random find because it's found very close by that little temple that I just showed you. And we can't say more than what I've just said here, but how tantalizing it is to suggest that somehow out there in Arad, you have also temple singing by this group who is much better known from the second temple period, but whose name is attributed to about a dozen psalms in the canonical book of Psalms. Sorry. What about the second temple period? So here's the model. Dan showed some pictures of it earlier. Dan, you will recognize that these are older photos when it was still in the gardens of the Holy Land Hotel. And as Dan showed you this morning, it's now been moved to the Israel Museum. Now, of course, when I say the second temple period, what you're looking at here is the last 100 years of the second temple period, which stretches more than 500 years. The model that's in Jerusalem shows you all the great Herodian expansion, and Dan spoke about all of that this morning. As long as I have this image up just as a sidebar, since it was mentioned, people asked about other places where people could gather. This is the Hippodrome right here, for example, that Dan referred to. Now, the books of Samuel and Kings are written contemporary with the events that are described, or nearly contemporary. So the history of Saul, David, and Solomon, and then all of the successors of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah are described in the books of Samuel and Kings, and most likely are contemporary or nearly contemporary with those events, 10th through 7th centuries. The book of Chronicles retells the story, although only of the kings of Judah. It ignores the whole kings of Israel, but it tells the story of David, Solomon, and all the successors, their dynasty lasting down to 586 BCE. But that book was written at a distance of several hundred years during the Persian period, if not even the early Hellenistic period. It devotes a lot of space to talking about what's going on in the temple. Now, as I said in the previous example, it retrojects much of that back onto the time of David and Solomon and the other kings. And so we don't see it as a historical text to talk about the First Temple period, but it tells us a lot about what's happening in the Second Temple period. Now, the Hebrew word for praise comes from the three-letter root He Lamed Lamed, Hallel, and the noun for praise based thereon is Tehillah. And you should be familiar with this word from English hallelujah, for example, praise the Lord. Now, the books of Samuel and Kings, a very considerably large chunk of literature, uses this verbal root only twice. Once, Absalom is the object of the people's adoration and praise, and once there's a soldier in the book of Kings who's doing some self-praise. Never used for God. When you get to the book of Chronicles and the related books of Ezra and Nehemiah, written at around the same time, you have 29 references, uses of this verb and this noun combined, all of them except one with reference to God. So the praising of God has become a much more prominent part of the consciousness of the people in a ritualized context in the Second Temple period. And here are some examples. So 1 Chronicles 16 tells us that David placed some Levites who were to give thanks and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel, right? And similarly in 1 Chronicles 23. So these are passages we don't have in Samuel, the earlier version of David's life story, and so we don't think that this actually happened in David's time. But the book of Chronicles, again, is telling us about the time of the author at his time period during the heyday of the Second Temple, and he's just retrojecting some of these customs back onto the time of David. Levites doing the singing, the praising in the temple. And many more passages. I gave you the one of Jehoshaphat earlier. Here's one of Hezekiah. So you have all of these expressions in the book of Chronicles using this verb to praise. 1 Chronicles 16 refers to, again, the passage we just looked at in verse 4, but also in verse 7, referring to a man named Asaph and his group. Asaph is another temple singer, and there are a number of psalms whose superscription, again, about a dozen of them, are attributed to the sons of Asaph. So we have the sons of Korach and the sons of Asaph, both associated with Levitical temple singing, and for whom we have a number of psalms with their names ascribed to them. So 1 Chronicles 16 is a prose account of what David's doing at the time of the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital and the bringing of the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. It would be a generation later until Solomon built the temple, of course. But there, within his speech, all sorts of psalms are quoted. And so 1 Chronicles 16, verses 8 through 22, actually is the quotation of Psalm 105. And then you can see Psalm 96 and little bits and pieces of Psalm 106. So you're getting the use of psalms for the first time in the literary context in the Second Temple period. They were authored in the First Temple period, and Jeremiah quoted the Psalm of Thanksgiving, but they don't seem to have a prominent use in temple worship because you just simply don't get them outside the one example of Jeremiah's quoting the pilgrims coming with their Thanksgiving offering. And yet in Chronicles, all of a sudden, so in the Second Temple period, you get this full-blown use of the Psalms, individual Psalms, for temple worship. And similarly, when Chronicles retells Solomon's prayer upon the dedication of the temple, the parallel to 1 Kings 8 appears in 2 Chronicles 7. Here you get Solomon actually quoting a part of Psalm 132. These verses here, 2 Chronicles 7, verses 41 through 42, are lifted right out of Psalm 132. Not mentioned in Kings, but now incorporated into the chronicler's version of that same historical account. And it's giving us a sense, there are 150 Psalms, it's giving us a sense of which of these Psalms or which passages from Psalms in particular were being used in temple ritual and temple worship. And this is actually part of a larger picture within the history of Judaism, which we call the textualization of Judaism. Because the texts don't reverberate in the first temple period, where sacrifices were occurring and so on and so forth. But the Torah is held up to a new level by Ezra. That's described especially in Nehemiah chapter 8. And the Psalms are being elevated to a new level as well by now gaining a place in temple ritual. If we move to the post-biblical period, the author Ben Sira, who lived circa 180 BCE, again, the same kind of thing. He retrojects back to David's time, but he's reflecting his own time period, of course, again in the heyday of the existence of the Second Temple. He tells us that David established harp singers and that they were to make sweet melodies with their ringing sounds, and that this would all give further dignity to the festivals, and that this was all tied into the praising of God's name. Incidentally, the Hebrew original of Ben Sira was lost, but it was recovered by archaeological and historical discoveries in the late 19th century from the Cairo Geniza of the Ben Ezra synagogue, and later on at Qumran and Masada. So we now have about 2/3 of the Hebrew original. Why am I bothering to show you this? Because the very passage we're looking at is right here, of course, in the lacuna. And how often does that happen in biblical research when the text you want to check is, of course, right there in the gap, something that those of us who work on Dead Sea Scrolls know very well. But fortunately, we have the Greek translation from which I was just quoting in the previous image. And there's a close-up of it. This folio is actually in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Well, we can actually make out a few words of the Hebrew, right? We have the entirety in the Greek. We can make out a few words in the Hebrew: niginot, tunes; shir, song; kol, sound. And in a marginal note, kol mizmor hanaim, the sound of sweet music. So we get a sense of what terms the original author of Ben Sira was using in Hebrew. The text was translated by his grandson into Greek. Josephus, very similarly, in the 1st century CE, retrojects what he knows from the temple back to David's time, right? And that the Levites were to sing hymns to God. Remember that Josephus is writing for a Greco-Roman audience. I can't help quote the very quaint line: "The Levites, which is a tribe of ours, were singers of hymns, and a part of this tribe ministered in the temple." I love that expression as he tries to explain Jewish customs to the non-Jewish world of the Mediterranean. The books of Maccabees from the same more or less time period, middle of the 2nd century BCE, also just takes it for granted that in temple rituals you have songs and harps and lutes and cymbals and hymns, right? Hymnic usage. It doesn't give us specifically what was being sung, which psalms, which this, which that. But all of a sudden, I shouldn't say all of a sudden, what you get from all of this evidence is a growing importance of the use of hymns, most likely psalms, but perhaps some other newly written hymns for temple worship. Now, the Mishnah was mentioned on several occasions this morning, both by Jim and by Dan. Let me give you a little bit of introduction as to what the Mishnah is. It comes from 200 CE. It is the earliest rabbinic text we have. It is a compendium of Jewish law. The legal texts of the Torah either repeat one another, like the list of forbidden animals in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, and the festivals, or they're not complete in what they're telling us. So Sabbath rest is of course, ordained, but it doesn't tell you what work is and what constitutes work and what may or may not be done on the Sabbath. So the early rabbis compiled the first law code of Judaism, the first real law code of Judaism, circa 200 CE, in which they wrote down in very great detail all of the material related to the holidays, to Sabbath, to dietary laws, to ritual purity laws, anything imaginable, how to observe the sabbatical year, anything imaginable. I'm showing you an image here of the best preserved manuscript of the Mishnah, which comes from 900 years later. It was written in Italy, circa 1100 CE, and it's now housed in Budapest. It's called Manuscript Kaufmann A50. And one of the reasons I do this is, A, you could search this on the internet and find the website yourself and see all of these images. Our colleagues in Hungary have put all of the images of this manuscript up on the web. And to remind ourselves that when we read books, and by books I mean printed books that we all have in our homes, there used to be something called printed books that people had in their homes, that they are, of course, all based on medieval manuscripts, right? Our Bibles, Old Testament, New Testament, our Mishnah, our Talmud, our pseudepigrapha, whatever it is, right? They were all transmitted to our Homer. It doesn't have to be Jewish or Christian religious text, right? They were all transmitted to us by medieval scribes, and this is the best preserved of the manuscripts of the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah has a tractate. Oh, let me go back a second. Written 200 CE. The remarkable thing about the Mishnah is that it preserves earlier and older traditions. Now, this is 130 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, but it frequently harks back to material that goes back to the 1st or 2nd century BCE, if not the 3rd century BCE. And actually, we know this is not the time to go into this in detail, we know this through the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they're referring, even though they are opposed to the system that becomes the Mishnah, they're in opposition to rabbinic ideas of later on. So we know that much of the Mishnah harks back centuries earlier, even though the text comes from centuries later, 200 CE. I mention this because Dan this morning showed you that Josephus's temple, the one he describes, is the one that he knew when he was alive, the one that Herod had greatly expanded. But the temple that the Mishnah describes in the tractate called Midot is actually an older one, right, from centuries before Herod's great expansion of the Second Temple. That would be an example of how the Mishnah preserves older material. And even though the temple's been destroyed for 130 years, it has a great interest in the temple. I actually should say a word about why the Mishnah has a great interest in the temple. At least a third, and probably more than a third if you were to quantify it, of the Mishnah is related to temple rituals, sacrifices, ritual purity laws, what the temple looked like, what they did in the temple, and so on. The reason is, I assume, we believe, that the rabbis who composed this text most likely assumed that the temple would be rebuilt. After all, history had shown them that the temple would be rebuilt, because when the first temple was destroyed, the second temple was rebuilt. And similarly, when the second temple was rebuilt, most likely they needed to keep track of all this material because there was an expectation that a third temple would be built. Of course, that never happened in the Jewish tradition. Now, a tractate of the Mishnah called Tamid means the daily sacrificial offering. This tractate actually tells us which psalms were related. Here's a picture up close. Which psalms were which were intoned each day of the week, Sunday through the Sabbath. And it gives us the incipits, the opening lines. It doesn't call it Psalm 24 and so on. And we can now, of course, figure out what these psalms are. Now, in the Masoretic Bible, only Psalm 92 has such a superscription. Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat, a psalm, a song for the Sabbath day. Incidentally, these psalms that you see listed here are still used in the Jewish liturgy today, down to the present day. So today's Monday, at the morning service, Jews would have recited Psalm 48. Right? And tomorrow, Psalm 82, and so on. Although the Masoretic Bible only has this one single superscription tying a psalm, Psalm 92, to the Sabbath, the Greek Bible, the Septuagint, actually gives us 5 such days. And here's one example of it from the oldest complete manuscript of the Septuagint. We have the Codex Sinaiticus, where this particular psalm, Psalm 94 in the Masoretic counting, Psalm 93 in the Septuagint counting, is ascribed to the 4th day of the week. Now, what are these psalms? Psalm 24. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Right? This is exactly what you would want to say as you were coming to the temple. Lift up your heads, O gates. You can just picture the person approaching the Jerusalem temple so that the King of glory may enter. Psalm 48, notice its reference here to the holy mountain, to Mount Zion. We envision, O God, your kindness in the midst of your temple. These are explicitly the kinds of psalms that you would want to recite in relationship to the temple rituals. It wasn't a random selection of psalms. That the Mishnah in Tractate Tamid actually preserves the memory that these were the psalms that were recited. Similarly for Psalm 93, in your house, referring to the temple, of course, Psalm 92, In the courts of our God, that would be the courtyards outside the temple, of course. Dan showed some great images of that earlier this morning. There's another collection of Psalms, Psalms 120 through 134, called in Hebrew Shir Amalot, the Songs of Ascent. And the Mishnah in the tractate Midot, which describes the temple, tells us that there were 15 steps that went up from the one court into the next court, and that on these 15 steps, the Levites would sing the same 15 psalms, Psalms 120 through 134, one psalm corresponding to one step. And there's that from that same Mishnah manuscript that I showed you before. Lengthy translation of it, which we're not going to read right now, obviously. Can we envision what this might have looked like? And yes, we can, due to the good work of Lane Rittmeyer, a Dutch architect, who has devoted his life and career to creating these images, showing us what the temple rituals might have looked like with all sorts of computer programs that he has at his disposal. So here you can see the great Nicanor gate with the 15 steps going up to that gate and the Levites standing upon them, clothed in white, reciting these psalms. So giving you a sense of what this temple would have been like. What's in these psalms that makes them so specific to temple worship? Psalm 120, the first of them, says, "Woe is me that I reside in Meshech." Where is Meshech? Far north, in northern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. "That I dwell amongst the tents of Kedar." Where is that? In the far south, Arabia. So this is Jews in the diaspora who would be coming, notice the poetic parallelism, Jews in the diaspora who would be coming from the far north and the far south on their pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And this is built into the very psalm. And then Psalm 134, the last of those psalms, you can imagine the priests in the temple saying goodbye to the people as they left. "Behold, bless the Lord, all servants of the Lord who stand in the house of the Lord. Raise your hands to the holy place. May the Lord bless you from Zion," right? They're saying goodbye to those people who've just come at the very end of this collection, Psalms 120 through 134. These were all used in the daily and festival rituals in the temple, according to the evidence that we have contemporary with these days and the Mishnah written at a distance of a century and a half. Psalm 132, which I quoted before, is part of this collection. And then another collection, the Hallel Psalms. This is Psalm 113 through 118. They don't get superscriptions telling you that these are the songs of Hallel, praise, but the word Hallel and Hallelujah repeat so often in this collection, plus Psalm 136, that this has become known in Jewish parlance as the Hallel, simply the Hallel, the collection of psalms of praise. And the Mishnah in the section called Psachim, which is to say dealing with Passover, actually tells us that when Jews brought their Passover sacrifice to the temple, they recited the Hallel, Kar'u et HaHallel. And here's that manuscript again, giving us that information to us in beautifully preserved professional scribal hands. So you're a Jew, you're going to the temple for Passover in the 1st century BCE or the 1st century CE, to bring us to the topic of our collective wisdom today, Jesus and the temple. And this is what a Jew would have been doing, reciting these psalms, Psalms 113 through 118. Psalm 118 at the end of that collection ends, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We bless you from the house of the Lord." And then it refers to the branches which are to be put on the altar at the festival time. This accords with the holiday of Sukkot, the fall festival, the Tabernacles or Booth festival of Sukkot, which was one of the 3 pilgrimages which was mentioned this morning. So these would be recited not only at Passover, but on the other pilgrimages as well. Before we get to Qumran, let me just say that this coming Friday night is the eve of Passover, and Jews around the world will continue to recite these psalms, which is to say the temple rituals have died out, of course, with the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. But I and my family at our Passover Seder this coming Friday night and again on Saturday night will recite these psalms, these very psalms at the Passover Seder. This is a continuity going back 2,000 years. And then they will be recited every morning in the synagogue for the morning service of the entire week of Passover. A look at Qumran. I wouldn't normally do this, but Jim Charlesworth is in the room. The Psalm scroll ends with a colophon from Cave 11, which gives us this remarkable information that David wrote. You think he wrote 150 Psalms? Look in your Bibles. That he wrote 3,600 songs. Songs to sing before the altar accompanying the daily perpetual burnt offering. That's that word tamid, which I mentioned before. For each day of the year, 364, and another 52 for Sabbath, and the new moons, and all the festivals. And you add them all up, and David wrote 4,050 Psalms. He was one busy poet, according to the colophon at the end of the Dead Sea Scrolls Psalm scroll. And there's that word tamid that I mentioned. Okay, Psalms to accompany the daily offering in the temple. Exactly what we've been talking about. The Psalms have become the hymn book of the Jerusalem temple. The commonest books at Qumran, Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. We have prayer texts which associate particular prayers with particular days of the week. We have this great text that Jim Charlesworth has been spending 10 years on his Jesus biography and 20 years on this text. Am I right, Jim? 50 years on this text. The Thanksgiving hymns from Qumran. A new collection of hymns, about 25 of them, which begin with the words, "I give thanks to you, O Lord." Were these being used by the Qumran community in their parallel temple service, if I can use that expression? And then really one of the most remarkable texts from Qumran, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, in which the poet tells us, the author tells us, that when the sacrifices are being done in the Jerusalem temple, the angels on high for the Sabbath, the angels on high are reciting these songs. And isn't that a beautiful thought to contemplate? Are we able to speculate? The Sadducees, tied to the priestly rituals of the Torah, probably didn't like the Psalms in the temple. The Pharisees, I'm sure, were okay with the Psalms in the temple because the later Mishnah from their rabbinic heirs talks about them. And the Essenes apparently had psalms, their own hymns like the Hodayot and the angelic hymns of the Psalms of the Sabbath Sacrifice. When the book of Psalms ends with the full orchestra, shofar, lute, lyre, timbrel, strings, pipe, cymbals, and so on. Let us also mention the dance that is mentioned here. It is the culmination of an entire psalmic hymnic tradition within Judaism to bring the entire book of Psalms to the close. Psalm 118, verse 26, which I quoted before, is the only passage in the book of Psalms, from the book of Psalms, quoted in all four Gospels. It is quoted exactly in the three in Mark, Matthew, and John, although John adds the word King of Israel at the end. And it is more or less quoted by Luke, although Luke changes the pronoun he to the king. But this is in Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, as most of you will know. And as he comes into Jerusalem, the people say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." I showed Psalm 118 before, but I want to show you, of course, that this is in that Hallel collection. This is still recited by Jews down to the present day on Passover, to give you the continuity of tradition and the linkage between Jewish tradition, the Christian Gospels, the life of Jesus as a Jew in the 1st century CE. Thank you.